Alpha?
On Alpha, the talk is where we say what we believe, but the small group is where the guests say what they believe. So hosting is about facilitating a discussion between the guests and listening to their point of view. Imagine for a moment that this ball represents the conversation in the small group, and John is the small group host. This is a discussion between John and Dan, which is fascinating for them, but it's boring for everyone else in the small group, because they're just watching, they're not participating. That is not the way the Alpha small group works.
Here's another way you could do it. John to Dan and back, and then John to Julia and back. Now this is better, but it still all revolves around John. That is not the way the Alpha small group works either.
Instead, the conversation should look like this. John kicks off the discussion with a question, and then the guests discuss it between themselves. Occasionally, John might need to step in and help keep the conversation going, but ideally, he listens, encourages, and says very little, ensuring everyone is involved.
The small group can be ruined by two things. One is the hosts or helpers speaking too much instead of encouraging the guests to speak. The second is allowing one guest to dominate the discussion. If this happens in the first session, try to talk to them after the discussion. Thank them for their contribution, but then ask them if maybe next time they could help you host the group by encouraging others to contribute. We've put together our 6 best tips for facilitating a great discussion on Alpha. Number 1, ask open questions. For example, on the second session, Who is Jesus? Instead of asking closed yes/no questions like, do you think Jesus is God? You could ask, who do you think Jesus is? Or what do you think it would have been like to be around Jesus? The Alpha Team Guide is a useful resource for hosting a small group and has some great suggested questions for each session to help the discussion get going.
Number 2, be encouraging. Most guests will be worried about looking stupid or getting tongue-tied. So if they're brave enough to speak, encourage them, whatever they say, even if you don't agree, especially if you don't agree. People are much more likely to come back if they feel comfortable enough to participate in the conversation.
3, be yourself. Now you may be thinking, what if I don't know the answers to people's questions? Well, being yourself is the best thing you can do for the group. If you don't know the answer, don't pretend you do. Simply say, I don't know, and maybe add, I will look into it for you and get back to you by next week.
Number 4, don't answer all the questions. If someone asks a question, open it up to the whole group by saying something like, that's a great question, what does everyone else think? There are a couple of exceptions, so if someone asks a specific question like, how many Gospels are there? You don't need to say, what does anyone think? There are 4 Gospels, and if you know it, you can tell them. Similarly, if someone asks, where are the toilets? You don't have to say, that's a great question, what does anyone think? Just tell them. And when the group has got to know each other a bit more, particularly after the Alpha weekend, you might want to begin to share your opinions a little more with the group, but it's important to keep the tone at the beginning.
5, don't be afraid of silence. Research suggests that people need around 6 seconds of thinking time before answering a question, especially when thinking about deep issues. Sometimes people need time to digest and think about an idea, and we can cut that off if we jump in too quickly. Now, obviously, silence can quickly become awkward, so at that point, you might want to rephrase the question, which is the 6th point. People process questions in different ways. Some people are very analytical and cerebral. Others are far more intuitive and reflective. For example, some people will love the question, what does forgiveness mean? Whereas others will respond much better to, have you ever had to forgive someone, and how did it feel?
So we love people, we listen to what they have to say, and then the 3rd thing we do is laugh. Alpha is supposed to be low-key, relaxed, fun. So try to avoid being intense. Intensity is not a fruit of the Holy Spirit.